A good bit of this audience is North American folks. In fact, about 54%, so a little more than half. And of course, esotericism has thrived in the New World more generally, from Spiritism in Brazil, Voodoo and Hoodoo in the American South, and various schools of occultism through the Americas. The European colonization of North America, however, in fact corresponded to the high watermark in the popularity of early modern Western esotericism in Europe. You'll think of those as the great glory days of alchemy, the Rosicrucian manifestos, the time period where Christian theosophy by Jakob Boehme was being developed, and the wide printing of text in the occult philosophy more generally. Text also translated into English. It was also the high watermark of the witch hunts. This, though, naturally raises the question, how did European esotericism reach North America? Or to put a finer point on it, who was the first esotericist, or occultist, I suppose, in colonial North America? And the answer to that question is rather surprising. It seems to have been John Winthrop the Younger, the son of the guy that composed the City on the Hill sermon and one of the co-founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop Jr. would go on to co-found and govern the colony of Connecticut. But combined with his colonial ambitions, Winthrop the Younger also planned to create an alchemical research center, a Pansophic research center. He brought the first substantial library of alchemical and occult writings to New England, including volumes that were once owned by John Dee. He brought John Dee's books, at least some of them, to Colonial, Connecticut. He founded the first colonial ironworks, the remains of which still survive and you can visit them. He became famous for the practice of Paracelsian Spagyric Medicine, and even used his knowledge of the occult philosophy to curtail some of the earliest colonial witch hunts. As we'll see, John Winthrop the Younger, aside from his decisive importance in the history of Connecticut, hi Connecticut people, he may well be the very first true American occultist. Indeed, Cotton Mather would actually refer to him as nothing less than Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes. Let's see how. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing for content like this, evidence-backed, free, and accessible content, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch we have on the channel. And if you're new to the study of esotericism and occultism, make sure to check out my study guide, which will orient you to the lay of the land of this quite complex field. And if you're interested in actual historical books of magic, the occult, and mysticism, check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comments. But now, let's explore the foundations of American occultism and esotericism in the Puritan. Yes, the Puritan founder of Connecticut, John Winthrop the Younger. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. When John Winthrop Jr. arrived at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in November of 1631, he was greeted with a volley of cannon fire and musket shot. The son of perhaps the most important North American colonial leader, Winthrop was seemingly destined for success. But the elder and the younger Winthrops, despite sharing a Puritan religious heritage, were significantly different from one another, as sons are from fathers. Usually. Specifically, the elder Winthrop represented the Puritan old guard, conservative and above all practical, with a single-minded aim to establish his new Zion in the wilderness. His son, however, while still sharing basically most Puritan values, especially a focus on individual faith and similar apocalyptic theological values pervasive in Puritanism, he had been tinged by an underground intellectual and spiritual development over in Europe. The younger Winthrop had taken an interest in alchemy in his early 20s, and he had traveled as far as the Ottoman Empire to learn its secrets. Indeed, all the while the Puritans were establishing their colonies in what we now think of as New England, he was exploring Western Esotericism as it exploded in popularity in Europe. The first few decades of the 17th century saw the publication of the Rosicrucian manifestos. Utopian thinking of all the kind was the rage. This would also see the time period in which the enormous 6-volume Theatrum Chemicum, the greatest collection of alchemical literature ever produced, was printed. Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy would also be translated into English for the first time and published in 1651. This was also the time period where Paracelsianism was flourishing all through Europe, and the Christian theosophy of Jacob Boehme first appeared. The Puritan Revolution was paralleled by the Hermetic, Esoteric, and Rosicrucian revolutions. And Winthrop the Younger was in the very heart of those European alchemical networks, sometimes known as the Alchemical Republic, which fueled this occult revolution. And while alchemy and Puritanism aren't often thought together, really, the key tying bind here is actually going to be the Paracelsian Alchemical Revolution. Recall for Paracelsus, and you can check out some episodes I have introducing you to the thought of Paracelsus, those works include theology as well as practical alchemy, both metallic alchemy and medical alchemy, iatrochemistry. The core of that practice was the unique place of the human being in the cosmos, as the hermetic bridge between the spiritual and physical worlds. Specifically, Paracelsus argued that the individual human relationship with the divine was key to alchemical success, and that by unlocking hidden, i.e. occult relationships in nature, then would the human being be able to act as a kind of helpmate with the divine restoration of the cosmos and nature more generally. This was achieved by careful experimentation with all aspects of nature, and not simply slavish appeals to ancient and medieval authorities that previous alchemical schools had done. Now, while Paracelsus distanced himself from the Protestant Revolution, especially distanced himself from Martin Luther, many of his ideas would prove compatible with Puritan theological concerns, and thus Winthrop the Younger became an enthusiastic member of the English Paracelsian circles, and as we'll see in a moment, he'd gain immense respect and fame as a physician using specifically Paracelsian Spagyrical cures in the colony of Connecticut. He was also a profound admirer of Dr. John Dee, something that we have in common, and he went as far as to collect volumes that once belonged to that famed Elizabethan magus. Those volumes would cross the Atlantic for the first time to serve as the most impressive colonial occult library of that entire period. In fact, some of those volumes, first with Dee and then with Winthrop, they remain in U.S. holdings, most famously in the New York Library. In fact, Winthrop thought so highly of Dr. John Dee and his hieroglyphic monad so as to employ that very sigil as a kind of signature, or checkmark kind of, for his records of alchemical books, his chemicals and equipment, all checked off using the symbol in a kind of private accounting system to know what he was shipping over to the colonies. Again, a seeming mismatch between Dee, a Catholic, although a strange one, who spent his last years communicating with angels, yes, and swapping his wife. We have to mention that every single time we meet, don't we? And the Puritan Winthrop, the two are a bit odd until one considers the aims of John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica. It was envisioned by Dee as a final symbol to restore all metaphysical symbolism, to capture all art, all science, all alchemy, and even reform religion as a form of apocalyptic renovation. Such a millenarian reformation and metaphysical restoration clearly spoke directly to Puritan values held by Winthrop, and this hermetic interest would inspire Winthrop even further. He would meet with, but let's be honest, he would be ultimately disappointed with the principal English translator of Hermetic wisdom into English, Dr. John Everard. Again, the guy is meeting with the very people translating the Corpus Hermeticum into English for the first time, even if he finds Everard's understanding of alchemy to be ultimately less than. But the younger Winthrop's Puritanism was far from the stereotype view of radical conservatism, which I think has come down to most of us in the United States with the buckle hats and no, they weren't that. Winthrop was a cosmopolitan before all else and sought the truth of the great work as far away as Islamic Ottoman lands, among Catholics as well as various species of Protestants. Among his earliest books that he brought to the colonies were volumes of Kabbalah. The Alchemical Republic, as we call it, crossed sectarian lines in the search for the secrets of nature, and this deeply informed the ecumenical, Irenic attitude of those taken up by the Rosicrucian Revolution, including Winthrop. This Alchemical Republic also intersected with another radical reform sweeping through Europe at the time, the concept of Pansophism. Unlike the literary utopianism of a previous generation, think of Thomas More's Utopia, John Comenius sought practical implementation of utopian values, especially universal education. To this end, Comenius sought to establish a universal, non-sectarian, a non-religious sectarian Pansophic college in which people could receive a rigorous interdisciplinary education on the completely new idea of Bacon, the Baconian form of science. Such a model forms the basis for basically all modern research universities in the world. Again, an odd fit with Puritanism, but Comenius, like virtually all his contemporaries, attached a millenarian component to this very project, specifically in the conversion of the indigenous people of the New World through education, but at least not through compulsion. That's a value also shared by Winthrop. I mean, again, sometimes progress is pretty incremental. Further, Comenius understood that any knowledge was ultimately tied with individual divine illumination, an idea he shared with Ficino and people like Cornelius Agrippa. Thus, the scientific act of reading the book of nature was intimately tied up with personal piety, a piety that crossed all religious barriers. Christ, who I follow, knows no sect, as Comenius had it. And that, again, positively Rosicrucian in character. Further, Puritanism and capitalism have always had a special relationship, Max Weber and all that. And in the practical alchemy of Gabriel Platz, another close associate of Winthrop and part of the Alchemical Republic, these streams would cross and meet. For Platt, the spiritual restoration of the human being had to be met with their material restoration. They had to go hand in hand. And thus, dominion over the earth given to the human beings in the book of Genesis, we had to make good on it. And Platt had turned from his quasi-alchemical studies. He has a mixed attitude about alchemy, especially transmutation, but he was focused on improving the human condition using systematic metallurgy, assaying, mining, things like the development of fertilizers, agricultural reform, and the development of new medicines. The Dutch Paracelsian, Johann Moraim, would deeply influence Winthrop's medical practice, especially in the use of antimony, but also in the importance of the role of salt in the alchemical process. You hearing that, Paracelsus? It's Paracelsus. Indeed, Moraim claimed that he had extracted the famed spiritus mundi in the form of extracting a specific salt from the distillation of morning dew. Most folks are going to think of the mutus liber. That's a bit later, but these ideas are already cooking around in the 17th century. I have a whole episode on the mutus liber if you're interested in extracting the spiritus mundi from dew. Moraim himself even established a practical alchemical plantation along those Pansophic lines on land inherited by his wife. He would in turn introduce Winthrop to Johann Glauber, and Glauber was the discoverer of sodium sulfate, that's interesting. Glauber, for his part, was also radically interested in using alchemy for practical human ends. Not transmutation, but something that would make human beings' lives better. And as such, he sought to, again, create effective fertilizers, insecticides, and food preservatives. Again, these lofty goals which we typically associate with alchemy, but aspects of modern life that we all take for granted. I mean, I'd rather have somebody working on better food preservatives than making gold. In fact, this was all part and parcel of a shift toward the professionalization of alchemy that occurred during this period more generally. In fact, that's a topic I've covered in another episode if you want to learn more about the abandoning of the idea of trying to make lead into gold and trying to make good fertilizer. I'm on team fertilizer. Though these connections, often known again as the Alchemical Republic, or more specifically the Hartleib Circle, Winthrop was enmeshed in the alchemical finds of other famous alchemists and hermeticists of his day, especially folks like Robert Fludd. But while so much of what they discussed was an alchemical restoration, renovation, or reformation, Winthrop himself had an altogether even more radical idea. He would return to New England in the mid-1640s and set the groundwork for literally building the Pansophic Utopian College of Light in the New World, specifically in the colony of Connecticut. First, under his father, he experimented with supporting the fishing industry. Most people thought that the colonies were basically going to pay for themselves through the fishing industry by creating effective salt works in the region. You need to salt the fish in order to be able to export them. Of course, salt had high theological value. The salt used in the Jerusalem temple sacrifices really symbolically meant a lot to the alchemists, but also salt was a key component in Paracelsian and thus had a huge alchemical value all of its own. With the onset of the colonial economic collapse, with the onset of the English Civil War, Winthrop sought to establish both mining and ironworks in the region. Indeed, he sought indigenous people to bring him various mineral samples from all over the area, with his special hopes put on a mysterious black ore that they brought him. This black lead, he hoped, could be refined into pure lead, one of the major English metallic exports of the time. Along with using some cutting-edge Dutch techniques, he also hoped to extract a generous portion of silver as well. Again, the English and the Dutch didn't exactly get along, but here alchemy crosses those kinds of nationalistic boundaries. Legend also has it of him striking gold somewhere in the hills of Connecticut and forging mysterious rings in the region to bind them all. All of these goals were part of his Pansophic goals of combining his Puritan theology, his alchemical knowledge, and his practical aims of restoring the human being into a colonial project that would, in his mind, attract all of the alchemists from many of the alchemical cadres that he had established in Europe to get them all to immigrate to Connecticut. There, on the blank slate of colonial New England, they could work unimpeded, absolutely as close to nature as God had made it, at least as they had believed. Of course, the Native Americans very carefully controlled the land there. He genuinely thought that he was going to create an alchemical tech hub, research facilities, and a Pansophic utopia in the Connecticut colony there by what is now the River Thames, there in New London. And he was primed for just that endeavor. His occult library was the best in the colonies. He was an ecumenical religious leader, and he became the governor of the colony to boot. But it was not to be. The salt works quickly failed. He moved on as soon as the ironworks were prepared, and they suffered from staffing problems and low quality ore. He hoped that mining would produce good results, but they were mixed at best. And as I mentioned, the English Civil War halted all immigration, not just those of alchemists. And the acrimonious end of the Pequot War meant that his new colonial endeavors would be contended over by war refugees, the remains of the Pequot tribe, native rivals, and the hegemony of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, led by his dad. His dad really did not help him a lot in this. Of course, then we have the Free Grace controversy and the trial of Anne Hutchinson, which would see religious tensions only rise during this period, probably in deference to his father and probably to avoid getting a target on his own back. The younger Winthrop did not weigh into the proceedings of the Anne Hutchinson trial. These theological matters would further lead to a brief but pretty intense scrutiny on the very few colonial alchemists, thus further chilling any real possibility of mass Hermetic immigration from Europe. The settlement at New London suffered repeated attacks upon the remaining Pequots there from rival natives allied with the Massachusetts Bay Company, again headed by his dad, kind of, itself with eyes on the whole area. Again, in many ways, Connecticut was caught between Rhode Island and Massachusetts wanted a chunk. But colonial alchemists continued their experiments with assaying local minerals, producing high-quality saltpeter, further processing and the production of unique medicines employing the flora and fauna and the nutrients that they had all newly discovered in the New World. But even with such, let's call them mixed results, the younger Winthrop did absolutely thrive and rise to fame as a physician, and here his alchemical medicines found especially widespread colonial use. Though, to be honest, medical care of any kind during this time period was much more likely to harm the patient than help them. I think they could have done nothing in most cases, and that would have probably been for the better. But this, of course, was a time period of widespread Galenic medicine in which you balanced out the humors of the body through things like bleeding people when they had fevers. They kind of killed George Washington doing that. He had access to the best health care you could get in the colonies, along with, of course, with various what are called cunning remedies, but these had the added risk of being accused of witchcraft when you used them. To this was added the specific matter of what we call medical providentialism that was dominant in the Puritan colonies. This theological position about medicine held that health, sickness, and death, along with basically everything else, they were Calvinists, after all, everything was totally in the hands of God. The smallpox epidemics that decimated the indigenous population, they were the wrath of God against these terrible pagans. The massive death rate of the English and the seasoning that took place upon arrival, that was just God testing the Christian population. Widespread infant mortality, the wages of sin. Thus, medicine was simply the means by which God planned healing, and if, frankly, you were doomed by God, well, you were doomed by God, and no medicine, no medical intervention was going to help at all. Add to that there were virtually no fully universally trained physicians in New England. Of course, they had their share of barber surgeons and things like that. So what ended up happening is that in New England, a lot of ministers basically doubled down as medical workers, though with little education. They typically had an anatomy book and an herbal book, though I'm not sure that made the situation better or worse, but it was quite dire. And here, the Paracelsian Winthrop actually flourished in this environment for a few reasons. First, his medicines, and all medicines, were all judged by, in terms of their effectiveness, by the signs they produced in the body. So if you took a medicine and it had a reaction in your body, that was a relatively good thing, no matter what the reaction was. Unlike the relatively weak herbal medicines of the time, Winthrop employed powerful chemical medicines as per Paracelsian doctrine. Specifically, these preparations included a strong dose of antimony and saltpeter, both immediate and powerful purgatives. So the more dramatic the effects, the better, at least as much as it was thought. Further, disease was originally popularly thought to originate and spread from the center of the body and then spread to the outside layers, and thus such purgatives, such as extremely powerful laxatives and emetics, which antimony and saltpeter are, were considered especially effective medicines. Secondly, Paracelsian medicine, like the more broad alchemical theory, had a theological dimension as well, such that, as you'll remember, that it was working in tandem with the divine to effect healing and health, very much in line with colonial medical providentialism. It was the means by which God acted. Further, it was also new, and we all like new medicines, so that had a positive shine to it. Next, Winthrop treated anyone and everyone, including Native Americans, for free. Again, the true doctor was really a conduit through which God cured and doomed as the divine saw fit, and Winthrop just didn't feel like he could charge anything for these kinds of services. Finally, he also had what we would now call really good bedside manner. He listened to clients, he took notes, he had medical histories ready for new visits. In fact, his medical notes for individual clients still survive down to this day. And apparently he just really came across as kind and wise, and most of all, godly. Gotta have that. Winthrop even developed a kind of color coding system to distribute his various treatments through the colonies of especially Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut via high-ranking colonial women. Again, showing that he had respect for women, which was not a thing that people had often at that time. And this was due, in fact, to the vast numbers of people flocking to New London for treatment. It became effectively a hospital town, and he had to farm out his medical treatments. In effect, both the doctor, the medicine, and its novel and powerful effects were all taken to be signs of divine grace. Again, this most famed doctor in the 17th century colonies spread the use of Paracelsian medicine, underwritten, of course, by Hermetic philosophy. These folks were basically engaged in the Hermetic Revolution without ever knowing it, probably. But given that European alchemists largely balked at the prospects of setting up a Pansophic research facility in the New England hinterland, Winthrop actually developed his relationships with the small network of alchemists already operating in the colonies. Now, I'm going to come back and do a whole episode on colonial alchemy because it is just fascinating. Surprisingly, alchemy was relatively widely attested and interconnected, at least by academic elites, from Virginia way in the south all the way up to Rhode Island. And in fact, some colonial alchemists held significant libraries of magic, the occult philosophy, astrology, and Kabbalah. Indeed, many of them went on to become the presidents of places like Harvard and Yale. One of the greatest alchemists of the time period of the colonies, George Starkey, the philosopher of fire, as he denoted himself, would publish extensively in Europe as Irenaeus Philolaethes. He's probably the most important alchemist ever produced in the American colonies. Again, a topic all worthy of at least an episode, especially him. He's amazing. However, given these alchemical connections, along with a deep education in the occult philosophy and power as governor of colonial Connecticut, Winthrop would perhaps make his most surprising impact in the history of esotericism. He would intervene personally and decisively to put a stop to witch hunting. Yes, it would take a Puritan with a profound education precisely in the occult to stop, at least in colonial Connecticut, the horrid business of witch hunting. Now, I've done a whole episode on the lesser known but very important Connecticut witch trials. It's always the Salem ones that get all the attention, but the Connecticut ones were earlier and, in fact, in some ways more lethal. But it's worth checking out that episode on the Connecticut witch trials to get a more full understanding of the situation at hand for Winthrop. But following several outbreaks of witch hunting and a lull and then a final outbreak of trials while Winthrop was in fact abroad obtaining the charter for the colony, Connecticut would see 37 witch trials, 11 of which resulted in execution, from Alice Young in 1647, who history almost forgot. She's literally mentioned on basically a piece of throwaway paper, sadly, to the release of Catherine Harrison in 1670. Now, for his part, Winthrop was horrified at these trials, not because he was skeptical of the possibility of diabolical power in the form of witchcraft, but from a legal and from an occult philosophical point of view, he considered these trials to be just a disaster. Upon returning from England, Winthrop and fellow alchemist Gershom Bulkeley, whose grave was just recently renovated and excavated, which is interesting, these two fellows forged a set of judicial reforms which greatly improved evidentiary standards, but also brought the legal understanding of witchcraft itself into line with the leading thinking in occult philosophy more generally. This just shows a bunch of Puritan yahoos. These were experts in the occult figuring out what to do with witchcraft trials. For instance, the number of witnesses that was used for spectral evidence was increased to 2. In fact, the typical requirement in capital cases more generally. And both witnesses had to independently attest to the exact same set of facts about the spectral encounter, something that, in practice, was virtually impossible. Further, reliable concrete proof of diabolical pacts had to be established, along with evidence that any use of witchcraft could not itself be explained by purely natural occult causation. Again, occult causation existed, but it wasn't inherently diabolical. Effectively, Winthrop and Bulkeley so increased evidentiary requirements and so narrowed what could be actually considered witchcraft that it basically made conviction for witchcraft impossible. Again, both men agreed that there really were diabolical pacts, there really were demons out there doing things, there really was illusory forms of magic, but both also had a deep understanding of natural magic and occult causation, basically the kind of stuff that was talked about in Book 1 of Agrippa's 3 books on occult philosophy, such that witchcraft was effectively defined out of judicial existence in Connecticut, at least as far as he could do it, among Bulkeley and Winthrop. And as for a generation in New England, and for the rest of the history of Connecticut, witchcraft trials simply did not occur for a whole generation and thereafter in Connecticut, largely thanks to these reformations. Thus, it took two Puritan alchemists with deep knowledge of the occult to defeat, at least locally, as much as they could, the insanity of the witch panic. Of course, Winthrop would go on to become the first colonial member of the prestigious Royal Society, headed up by folks like Newton. Of course, that very society would also attempt to have Winthrop prepare a natural history of the region to do, as the English had done in Ireland, basically prepare the way for establishing deeper dominion in the colonies in order to, do what colonists do, extract all the resources and take them back to the home country. Winthrop, to his credit, knew what was up. He carefully dodged those requests and deflected them, and he would deliver from the colony some kind of weird novelty or curiosity to deflect basically having to create this document that would undermine colonial sovereignty. He would donate a 3-foot-long telescope to Harvard, making it that university's first scientific instrument. Indeed, he claimed to actually have spotted a fifth moon of Jupiter, which, with that kind of telescope, is interesting but unlikely. And on April 6, 1676, he'd pass away from this world, spending his final days dealing with the emergent nightmare that was King Philip's War. By then, the philosophical and spirituality of the Western world, its esotericism, had found a new home in North America among a slew of alchemists, students of Kabbalah, and those taken up with the occult philosophy. But I'd suggest that the first foundational occultist, the first foundational alchemist in some ways, the Christian Hermes, John Winthrop the Younger, ought to be considered the first among the earliest of all American esotericists. Thus, for all my North American occultists and esotericists, you have an unlikely ancestor, an unlikely spiritual ancestor in John Winthrop the Younger. A fact that perhaps sits unwell for both Puritans and occultists alike. The lifetimes and esoteric practices of Winthrop are absolutely amazingly covered in Walter Woodward's America's Prospero, and I cannot recommend that volume enough. It was a joy to read in the preparation of this episode, and in fact, this episode would have been impossible without that book. What fantastic scholarship. Further, for the hardcore nerds out there, I see you over there. If you want to take a look at a fantastic article by Wilkinson, it actually tries to reconstruct Winthrop's alchemical library, every single volume that we think Winthrop had, including the volumes held by John Dee, which are now, and I think principally in the New York Library. So that is like for the hardcore nerds. In fact, I think I'm going to come back to that list because I kind of want to do a tour of what it would look like to walk into a colonial alchemical lab in the 17th century. What would you see on the shelf? What kind of equipment would they have? What would the experiments look like? Again, I want to come back to this whole topic of colonial alchemy. I think it's just a fascinating topic. Of course, more alchemy to come. It's honestly my first esoteric love, as I think many of you know. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.